Hello and welcome to this episode for the Survivor Diaries. This episode is about domestic abuse, the child arrangements proceedings, if you've got domestic abuse continuing there. And these are probably my three most frequently given bits of advice. So this is my best advice. I normally do those disclaimers, so I'm just going to do those again. I am a solicitor in England and Wales, although this episode about my best advice isn't really going to apply, because if you're dealing with domestic abuse, then this is generally what I would say to people is the best thing to do. And it doesn't matter whether you're the person experiencing the domestic abuse or you are wondering if you are perpetrating domestic abuse. The advice is still the same. So I'm going to give you my three best pieces of advice in this video here. Other disclaimers that I just quickly give, as well as being a solicitor in England and Wales, I also always say that I'm giving very general advice. There are some circumstances where, you know, it would be better to take advice if you can possibly do that. In England and Wales, there are lots of places where you can take free legal advice. Rights of Women provide legal advice by telephone. Citizens Advice Bureau, they provide advice. And also you'll find that a lot of family lawyers will offer an initial consultation just to see if they can help and to give you pointers in the right direction. I also do disclaim that I am going to refer to Pat Craven's Dominator in the videos. Now that is because for me it's the best model. That in my circumstances, having experienced domestic abuse and this continuing through child arrangements, this is what to me made the most sense at the time. I do accept that it is presenting the information in a very sort of like male to female, assuming that the male is the abuser and that the female is the recipient of the abuse. And while I do say domestic abuse is a gender-specific issue, violence against women and girls has a significant effect on women. I'm not going to get into that. That's a separate episode that we're doing about the gender issue. Although I do say that, I need to make really clear that domestic abuse can happen to anybody. You can be a man experiencing domestic abuse from another man, or you can be a man experiencing domestic abuse from a female perpetrator. Okay, I don't think that there is enough provision for male victims of domestic abuse and also for female perpetrators of domestic abuse. And this is something that I will keep coming back to. So three pieces of advice. Now the first two is advice that I give to people regardless of whether or not they are the perpetrator of the abuse or the person who is subject to the abuse. So whether they're the respondent of allegations of abuse or whether they're making allegations of abuse. Best advice 1 and 2 is going to apply to them. And then the third piece of advice is if you think and realise that you are experiencing domestic abuse being perpetrated against you, what's the best advice that I give there? Or what's the advice that I seem to give a lot? And that's what I want to tell you about in these videos. First of all, we're dealing with child arrangements proceedings and we're talking about allegations of domestic abuse. My first advice to clients is to know what domestic abuse is, to know what it's understood to be by the law. So we have statutory definitions. These are ones that are set out in different acts, different laws. So we have the newly enacted Domestic Abuse Act 2021, which was enacted in April this year. Section 1 of the Domestic Abuse Act sets out a very wide, very broad definition of domestic abuse there. For child arrangements and domestic abuse, I'll also refer you to Practice Direction 12J. Remember, we're talking about the England and Wales jurisdiction. Practice Direction 12J, paragraphs 2 and paragraphs 3, again, this is more expanded, more detailed now about the impact of domestic abuse on the other parent and on any children. And it's now understood to have a massively significant impact on children. So that's the first piece of advice. If somebody comes to see me, be they a recipient of allegations of domestic abuse or be they making applications of domestic abuse, what I will say is, do we understand what domestic abuse is here? I do refer people to the Freedom Programme because of its profound effect on me. When I first read that book in 2010, I was profoundly affected. It made perfect sense, and that's why I refer to the Patriarchal Society in my earlier videos. I do understand that this doesn't account for male victims of domestic abuse, or it doesn't seem to, but I do believe that if you are a non-abusive male victim of domestic abuse, you will be able to watch these videos and understand why I'm referring to this. It's just an earlier model and one that I can personally relate to. So that's the first piece of advice: to know what domestic abuse is, to understand those definitions, and to be able to honestly think, is this something that's happening here? Is it something that I'm doing, or is it something that the other person is doing? Second bit of advice, and this applies again, I'm telling you, this applies to perpetrators of abuse, and it also applies to people who are making allegations of abuse. And this is, I affectionately call this one TTFT, which stands for tell the truth, as you can tell. So, tell the truth, TTFT. This is very specifically about domestic abuse. And if you're making allegations of domestic abuse, you need to be not making it up. That's obvious, point one. You need to be not exaggerating. Don't exaggerate the point. Don't, if something was thrown at you, don't suddenly say that a whole load of just don't exaggerate. You just tell it as it is. And right the way through the Survivor Diaries videos, you'll see this consistent theme that I'm bringing out, which is about telling the truth. Tell the truth. Tell the truth. Why tell the truth? Well, ultimately, if we're dealing with child arrangements and domestic abuse, it's the best outcome. We're going to achieve the best outcome in the shortest possible space of time. And I talk more about this, but if a person is able to tell the truth, and I have huge respect for people who can tell me the truth about what's going on, no matter how ugly it is. I can talk to you about my ugly truth and what has happened to me in the past, and I do this, and I will do this in these episodes. I will acknowledge if I've responded to violence or if I have in any way behaved inappropriately myself. And this is a matter of personal accountability. It's not really for a legal video about domestic abuse, but domestic abuse and dealing with it is about a matter of personal accountability. The willingness to actually look and say, could it be that I am doing these behaviours?
Nothing catastrophic could happen from telling the truth. I mean, come on, really. There might be some consequences, but then those consequences need to be dealt with at some point, whether it's now or later on.
We're about to do a series of videos with the full support of Pat Craven, which looks at what domestic abuse is and how in particular that manifests itself in the child arrangements. So if you are wondering if what you are doing is abusive, please do look at those videos that we're about to present. Telling the truth means that if you were to genuinely think, right, okay, well, what I did there was not right, okay, that was not good, and I want to change it, then I have got so much respect for you. Again, like I said, if people can tell the truth, no matter how ugly, total respect. If they can own what's happened, if they can own what's done, then that's the first step to actually changing the behaviour. It's like the 12 Steps recovery program, and I've recently had a look at the Russell Brand recovery steps. And so step one, which is about honesty and acknowledgement and accountability for what's done, taking responsibility for what's happened. That's honesty, and I think he refers to it as, are you a bit? Telling the truth, whether you are making or refuting allegations, that's really, really important. If you are going to acknowledge what's happened, then that is the first step to actually being able to do anything about it, and that is actually what takes you into a better place, a better relationship with the co-parent that you're going to have a relationship with. And do you want it to be this toxic, controlling, angry way, or are you willing to let go of that now and move on to something else? That's a personal thing that is unique to every individual. Telling the truth isn't just about the best way to, in my humble opinion, the best way to deal with the issue if you are the perpetrator. Telling the truth is also important if you think about the person who's making the allegations. And if a person starts to exaggerate allegations, one of my pet hates is false allegations. I hate false allegations because there are so many necessary allegations needing to be heard. So false allegations really annoy me. I'm not the person who makes the judgment about what's a false allegation. That's the court. And I look at evidence. If a person is exaggerating or making something so much worse in their allegations, then that to me shows that they are not reliable in what they're saying. So telling the truth, it's important even if it doesn't seem that significant, or if you're saying things that don't necessarily help your case, or it doesn't feel like they help your case. Like, well, yes, that they're a totally awful person to me and they're a really good parent. It makes you more reliable as a witness. And fundamentally, it allows the court to get to grips with the true facts of the case as quickly as possible. Another reason for telling the truth is in dealing with your solicitor or your legal representation, your barrister or your solicitor, and dealing with the court system generally. It costs money to make an application. It costs money, a lot of money to speak to a solicitor, and it costs a lot of money to be represented by a barrister. Why would you speak to a solicitor and not tell them the truth? Because if you do not tell the solicitor the truth about the situation, you are not getting the right advice for your circumstances. There are some situations where a solicitor would have to breach confidentiality, but those ones are pretty standard on what you expect. If there was a risk of harm to a child, or if there's a risk of harm to yourself or to others around you, kind of that sort of stuff. That's the kind of thing that solicitors can't keep confidence, but everything else they pretty much can. So it's worth thinking about that before you even speak to a solicitor. What's the point of seeing a solicitor and then telling them that you didn't do something when you did? Because every bit of advice you're going to get is wrong from there. Summarising, we want you to know what domestic abuse is before you make the allegations, before you respond to the allegations that you've received. What is domestic abuse? Are you willing to have a proper look and see if that's what's going on? Tell the truth. Tell the truth, as we name that section, TTFT. Tell the truth. And this one is more specifically if you realise that you are a person who is subject to domestic abuse. Now, this is really good advice, and I do give this a lot. So this is my third best piece of advice. And this is about grey rock. I'm not going to go into it here. I'm going to surmise it. But look up the method or the technique of grey rock. And in the summary, this involves when you have to deal with somebody who is toxic, narcissistic, abusive, and the key word is have to deal with them. So if you don't have to deal with them, don't. That's best advice there, just don't deal with them. If you have to deal with them, and this is very relevant in this situation, because if you're a co-parent, you have to continue a relationship with your abuser. And this is the bit, family justice system, court staff, CAFCAS, social services, please see this. This is the bit what's horrible, where you have to interact with your abuser all of the time, and it causes so much harm, so much damage to the non-abusive party, the non-abusive co-parent, and obviously any harm to the co-parent is then harmful to the children as well. So grey rock is the ability to only give the information that's necessary, no more, no less, and to control any emotional response, not to have any emotional response. And that's based on the idea that the narcissist is feeding off your response, feeding off your reaction to things, and feeding off you being upset because the children are upset because they can't do something they thought we were going to do, and apparently it's your fault, etc. And you're supposed to be triggered, you're supposed to be having a reaction. Grey rock is where you say, I know I am, and I'm not going to. So you just give the information. The children need picking up on Thursday, and no more, nothing else. And that can be protective to you on a psychological level if you're experiencing domestic abuse. And also, because what you effectively do is emotionally flatline in any correspondence. Correspondence, if you're in an abusive situation, should always get it into writing. Equally important bit of information advice here. Get that into text messages or emails as quickly as possible, because it's evidence. And then if the abusive behaviour, the tone, all of that sort of stuff is continuing, and they will do, that continues, and it's just this general continuing abusive behaviour, you've got that there. But when you don't react, when you don't kick off because you've been gaslit, when you don't do that, it actually means as well that you're not reacting, provides a kind of flat line. And then what is really clear to the court and to professionals working in the court is that you can see that it's one person constantly having a go, constantly having a go, constantly having a go. And instead of responding, getting into a high conflict situation where we both look like two parties fighting, you don't do anything. So it's just one person just trying to get a reaction. And that becomes really obvious to the court. So that's a really good way of showing abuse to the court. So in summary, they're my 3 best pieces of advice. I'm sure this is a longer video than necessary. But in summary, those are to know what domestic abuse is before you make or respond to allegations of domestic abuse in children proceedings. Tell the truth with the court system, with your partner, with your solicitor. And if you can tell the truth about it, that's the first step to overcoming and changing things. And if you want to do that, if you consider yourself to be potentially showing abusive behaviours, there's the Freedom Programme for men, which is more of an information type. This is what it is, kind of like these videos are going to be. Or there's domestic abuse perpetrator programs, which are quite intensive, looking at the behaviours. If that enables people to relate better to the other co-parents and to the children, then how can that be a bad thing? Okay, that's my best advice. I hope that's a helpful episode, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode or vlog, hopefully in the next series of episodes, which is an upcoming exciting project, including webinars with Pat Craven's Dominator in the court proceedings. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you and goodbye.